Welcome back to episode 2 of the Strength Connect podcast. Today we spoke to Luke Tulloch, a very intelligent, very insightful man currently residing in Sweden where he runs his online business. He's been a trainer for 15 years and grew up in Sydney, Australia.
That's right. Plenty of interesting discussions we had today. These included things like mindfulness and stress management. We looked at the 10 simple rules for reading a scientific paper and how this informs navigating a lot of the misinformation, which is online these days, especially in social media. And goes without saying, we talked a lot about exercise programming. So some of the principles which we talked about last week with Brandon, including reps in reserve and training till failure, training volume, and also things like exercise selection. We also did a lot of discussion about introspection when it comes to goal setting and how important values are, not only for the coach, but also for the individual in their own fitness pursuits.
I hope you guys enjoy it. And if you do, please feel free to give it a rating on Spotify. Luke, how's it going, man?
It's going good. We got some sun in Sweden, which is a big plus. So I'm happy.
Very nice. Very nice. Look, man, I just wanted to say thank you very much for coming on. Personally, this is a very exciting episode for me because it's a bit of a fangirl moment. I spent many years starting out as a PT, driving to Plus Fitness in the morning, listening to a podcast. So it's pretty surreal.
Oh, mad. Oh, that's sick. That's really cool, mate. Thanks. I want to record more of those podcast episodes. So that's a good reminder for me.
I was having a laugh when I was listening to a few of your podcasts, Luke, and every time you jump on, you say I haven't published for a while. And
yeah, I know. Mate, it's a couple of months in between each, or maybe a month or whatever, in between each time I get to record. So every time I'm like, fuck, this has been a while. I better mention it. And then I realized actually I say that every time. So
yeah, they're incredibly useful podcasts. And I've got a lot of my clients onto them because the way that you can take research, take complex topics and make them very digestible, I think is one of your strengths for sure.
One of those episodes that I listened to today, Luke, was looking at the reading research and the 10 simple rules for reading a scientific paper. I want to get into that a little bit later in the podcast because I think what our podcast is all about essentially is unpacking a lot of the misinformation that's online at the moment. Something that Aidan really wants to talk about is, I guess, managing all these different social media platforms in today's day and age and how much media and content is coming at us. And so I think giving our listeners a little bit of ammo to help them unpack this information online is something that we kind of want to do today with this podcast.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds good. I think, there is this sort of gap between researchers and then practitioners and then the end user. And so I think as coaches, we can often sit in that in-between space. And I probably made the mistake earlier on about trying to be too much like a researcher and talk in researcher language, if that makes sense. So, we have a really important role to play as being that bridge. So that's what I kind of view myself now. So that'd be really cool.
Cool. Before we jump into that, do you want to just give the listener, if they don't know you, a brief intro as to, how you ended up living in Sweden? Because we know you obviously started out in Australia, started as a PT in Australia. So a little bit about that, your journey.
Yeah, man. So I'm 36 this year. I started coaching people. I was a personal trainer when I was 18 and I was working in person in Sydney, big box gyms, Fitness First, that kind of thing for a while. During that time, I went back to uni and did a double degree, or I started a double degree in psychology and biochem, and then transitioned that into a neuroscience degree. And essentially got to a point in 2019-ish where the business was going pretty good, but we decided, my wife and I, that we wanted to go travel. So I took the business online and went overseas, and then the pandemic happened. My wife is Swedish, so we ended up just staying in Sweden, and here I am. So we ended up staying for longer, had a kid here, this kind of thing. So yeah, just work online and sort of clients from all over the place. The main thing was sort of body composition and powerlifting related for most of it, but it does span a little bit now. People wanting to work a bit more on like their body image and working quite a lot with other coaches. They can sort of see my process. I mean, coaches need coaches too as well for their own training, and also just to, I suppose, educate them a little bit. So kind of runs the gamut in terms of stuff that I talk about with people, but it is, I suppose, more on that body composition powerlifting slant. Yeah, but it's pretty fun that way. It challenges me in a lot of different ways. But I think for me, my coaching styles evolved quite a lot from essentially trying to look smart to actually delivering useful information and being a little bit less about the nuts and bolts of like these are the mechanisms of how things work, and a little bit more about how can we actually implement this, because I think fundamentally everyone kind of knows the basics of how to do stuff. Like hypertrophy training is not that complicated. Losing fat is not that complicated theoretically. You can make it quite complicated, but it's really the implementation and the context where it becomes challenging. So I think that's probably where I've evolved from the start of my career to where I am now.
And how would you, I guess, describe your own training journey? Because I know the priorities maybe shifted a little bit, especially over recent history, obviously having your first child. And I know you've talked a little bit about that on social media, reducing your training sessions, but I've seen some photos from a while back, and you definitely put in a fair bit of work when it comes to hypertrophy at some points.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Looking back, I was a bit of a monster, I think. Like, I remember just not really being able to fit into many clothes and stuff like that, and finding it pretty awkward to move around, chafed thighs all the time, that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, I think my sort of love for growing muscle and that kind of thing really waned probably in that 2018, 2019 period, just before we started traveling anyway, just because you kind of end up being like, well, what's the end goal here? But obviously traveling and then having the pandemic and then having a child sort of really impacted the ability to actually, even if I wanted to, train in that fashion. And so for me, it sort of came into finding a way to fit training into the rest of my life. And that's something that I do talk about quite a lot, is just having some clarity on your values, so you understand how does training and nutrition actually fit into your life, what are you trying to do with it, and how does it leave enough space for other areas of your life that are important to you, which I have quite a lot, to be honest. Like I sort of have a personal approach of trying to be a bit of a renaissance man. In other words, having a bit of knowledge about everything and having broad interests. And so when you think about it, if you're a coach and you started training at 18, it's like I got into it because I was obsessed with fitness. And so I'm someone who was, playing rugby. I was obsessed with going to the gym. I go to the gym when I'm 18. I'm hanging around other trainers. My social life is trainers. My hobbies are training and reading about training. You end up just getting quite one dimensional. And so, although in some ways now it's a bit like, oh, I can look back and be like, oh, geez, I was so big and strong and I had all this time to train and this kind of stuff. At the same time, I think you end up becoming much more well-rounded in everything that you do. And so, yeah, for me, it was about finding ways of making training more efficient and making it effective, despite the fact that I wasn't spending 10, 12 hours training extremely hard all the time now. And that certainly comes with having a kid. If any parents are listening, you know what I mean. You got to make it count when you can. And I think surprisingly, really, you can actually make a lot of gains and make most of your progress with surprisingly little. There's more and more research coming out on that. And my personal experience certainly reflects that. So, all is not lost. It's definitely not a case of like, you have to train 4 days a week for at least an hour to actually make any progress. That you can get away with far less than that, although it won't be optimal gains. It'll still be pretty good.
Yeah, and I think that's where a good coach and good programming can really come in handy, when you can make things as efficient as possible and ensure that what you're doing is of a high quality. And someone like yourself who has a really good understanding of programming, you could probably get a fair amount of work done in, it's 3 sessions in a week.
Yeah, no, totally. If you understand those principles, then like I think actually a lot of my programming is about just trying to make things as efficient as possible, because I personally don't see the point of spending, unless you have a preference for it, spending all this time in the gym and all this time thinking about training and nutrition, when you can kind of get 80, 90% of the way there in a far more efficient time. Like if I can do the same thing in a half-hour session that would take me an hour, why wouldn't I do that? So it's been like a personal interest of mine that I've sort of pursued quite a lot from a research perspective, and then also experimenting with stuff in my clients' programs and in my own program. So yeah, definitely a philosophy of mine now.
I guess in terms of your volume, intensity now with your training, just for the listeners out there, because I'm sure there's many listeners who are in a similar context where maybe they're working a 9 to 5 job and they only have time to get to the gym a couple of times a week versus someone who's a bit more devoted, dedicated to strength training, or a fellow personal trainer who's in the gym for a lot of time during the week, and they have that ease of accessibility to the weights and the equipment. How's things changed for you? And I guess what advice would you give to people who are strapped for time in terms of training principles?
Well, interestingly, there's been good research coming out now. It's mostly around like what you need to do, minimum amounts you need to do to maintain strength or even build strength. And it's pretty low. It's like a couple of hard sets a week will do it to in the short term for you to continue to make strength gains. So like 8 to 12 weeks. It's probably pretty similar for muscle growth as well, you know. So if you think about what's often recommended in terms of volume, we will use this sort of weekly sets kind of idea to communicate how much volume do you need to do to make muscle gains. And there's certainly research showing that you, generally speaking, the more volume you do, the more gains you'll make. But I think that often misses something, which is how much of an actual physical difference does that make? So, you know, I had a bit of a rant about this recently about, you know, fitness influencers not really including the effect size in the posts that they're making. In other words, you can say one thing is better than the other, but it's often left unanswered. Well, how much better is it? So if I do 10 working sets a week on a muscle group, compare that to 20 or 30 working sets, like how much better is it getting when I get to 20 or 30? And I think often the sort of visible difference that you're making to the muscle is way, 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 way less than people think. So I've always been personally quite responsive to lower volumes in general. I've always kind of had a philosophy of using lower volumes. So if you were to say the average person should be doing 10 to 20 working sets per week on a muscle group to sort of maximize muscle growth, I've always been on the lower end of that personally, but I've actually found that going even lower than that still seems to be able to get you some progress, you know. So 4 to 6 hard sets, going close to failure on a muscle group is probably still enough to make progress, at least in the short to medium term. And if you think about how much time that takes, it's very little, especially when you then combine it with other training methods like supersets, using drop sets or rest pause sets, which cuts down your rest periods significantly. If you think about when you're training in the gym, the majority of it is actually sitting around not doing anything. So if you do a set and then you rest 2 or 3 minutes, you know, the set's probably going to take you 20 seconds maybe. And then it's 2 or 3 minutes of sitting around, and then it's another set. If we can eliminate those rest periods or reduce them drastically by, say, doing another exercise in between, or by using drop sets or rest pause sets or whatever, you're cutting down all that dead time in the gym essentially. And the sessions, so I've done rough back of the napkin math with it, and it can reduce your, you know, using supersets can reduce your workout time by 40-ish% without changing the volume, the exercises you do, the rep ranges, or anything else. And so just combining those different methods, I think you can end up with sessions that are like 20, 30 minutes that are actually highly effective. And we just have to try and get over that sort of cognitive dissonance that we have of like, oh, that's not enough for it to be a really, really effective workout when it is. And I suppose the last piece I'll add to this is that some people get really nervous about dropping their volume low or not training for long enough or whatever it is. But again, if we look at the research, the amount you have to do to maintain your muscle is actually very, very low. So I always tell people, look, run an experiment. And the absolute worst case scenario is that you'll maintain what you've already got. And it's really no harm done, you know. The one study that I often cite for that essentially had people doing a fair amount of work on their quads, and then one group either continued to do 1/8 of that original volume or 1/9 of that original volume, and the other group did nothing. The group that did nothing obviously lost strength and size, and the group that did even just a couple of sets a week ended up maintaining their muscle size over 5 months. And so literally the worst that's going to happen is you'll maintain where you're at. But best case scenario, you've discovered a more efficient way to train by reducing your sets, and maybe you enjoy your training more. Maybe you get in more sessions because now you actually go, oh, this will fit into my timetable. So that's the approach that I take now with a lot of people.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to build muscle, and I think changes in training over time has definitely been a testament to that. You know, and what you're talking about before about, you know, less volume, maybe, you know, utilizing intensity techniques. It reminds me of something I've noticed. I work in a gym called Olympus in Sydney Southwest, and it's a pretty old gym, so it has a wide demographic. So there's a lot of older guys that have been there for like 40 years, and there's also a lot of younger guys like myself, and it seems more popular now for people my age to start doing low volume, maybe resting a little bit longer, utilizing, you know, partials at the end of sets, rest pause, and we're having longer rest periods, less sets, but I guess you could say the quality, maybe the stimulus of those sets a little bit higher. Whereas the older guys, they're very much like rest shorter, let's pump more sets into, you know, the session, because that's how you grow. And it's interesting to see that I can tell that both can work. It's just about, you know, preferences a lot of the time.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's definitely a lot of different ways you can approach muscle building, but I agree. Like, you can do quote unquote less intense sets, staying further away from failure, whatever, resting shorter, and just do more of it for sure. And there are some approaches in the research that have looked at stuff like this and found that as long as you're sort of matching I suppose the effective sets, the effective reps, so to speak, then they pretty much give the same result. But unfortunately, that sort of former approach, which is what probably a lot of people would traditionally have done, higher volume, staying further away from failure, potentially, maybe even doing higher reps and stuff. I think probably like traditionally the sort of muscle building rep range was probably thought of as more like at least double figures, but not so much like as low as 6 reps or whatever. You know, that can work, but it just takes more time because you're just doing more work essentially. And then there's also this issue of potentially inducing more fatigue because you're doing more work that is not super stimulative of muscle growth, but it's still generating fatigue. And so that approach can definitely work. But I personally see a lot of people who use that approach and they're pretty tired, they're pretty fatigued, they're pretty over how much they train for the return they get on it. Like, it's really common for me to get, especially females for some reason, who are doing a shitload of sets, like 30 sets a week or whatever, on their glutes a lot, or their hamstrings, because those are the areas that they want to grow, feeling like they're spending 2-hour sessions in the gym, they're training 5 days a week, and they're exhausted. Their loads haven't really gone up that much. They're working really hard, obviously, but they're not really getting the growth that they want from it. And so in those situations, I really just feel like, man, we could probably halve your set volume, just make it like more effective. You wouldn't feel as tired and you would grow more and you'd spend less time training. Like, it's a win-win-win-win, you know? So I do see that quite a lot.
That's a really good point, like how you're actually feeling. Because I noticed similar gains doing more volume versus less volume, but the stark difference is the fact that I could progress for a lot longer periods of time without needing to deload.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I found the same thing. So I worked with a coach myself, like 5-6 years ago. Oh, probably more than that now. Time just seems to be a bit weird now, but and I was doing like a lot of volume under this coach. Like, the approach was essentially that Renaissance periodization style, or how it used to be. I don't know if they still coach this way, where you would basically have a baseline number of sets that you would do in your first week, and each week you're essentially, as long as you're recovering, you just add an extra set and an extra set, and your volume just goes up exponentially that way. Like, if we calculate the volume load, the sets times reps times weight lifted, and you're doing 3 sets, and then you increase it to 4 sets on every exercise, I mean, so, you don't even need to calculate the volume load. It's a 33% increase in volume, right? And then you do that again the next week. It's another massive increase in volume. It's 25% increase in volume. And it's happening over such a short span of time that, like, by week 3 or 4, you're just cooked because you're doing so much extra volume, doing like double the volume that you started with. And I found doing that approach, I was irritable, my joints hurt, I didn't actually want to train, but my sessions were taking 2 hours. It was just a nightmare, and I actually hated training. So certainly I think that approach can be rethought.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue into the next part of the discussion. That are you seeing that in today's day and age, it's a lot harder for your clients to really grasp what's important with the amount of misinformation that's out there and the amount of media that's published, and just navigating all of that can be a real challenge for a lot of young people, I imagine.
Yeah, well, certainly I think people are exposed to many more ideas, which is a good and a bad thing. I often get questions about, hey, I saw this thing on Instagram. What do you think? And a lot of it is the reply is, well, I don't think much of it. I don't think there's much there, to be honest. You have to be diplomatic sometimes. But yeah, there's definitely that. And, of course, I don't really blame people because you, as creators, you are incentivized to come up
Yes.
with novel stuff, and that's just how it is. That's the platform. But you have to understand when you're consuming that stuff that is that's the format. So I don't think it's the problem with the creators or with the audience. I think it's the problem is with the medium itself. You have to understand that when you're using that medium, how the information is being delivered to you, the type of information you're seeing, like it's driven by the platform. And so in that sense, I think we have a responsibility as the audience and also as creators, I suppose, as to what information we expose ourselves to. Because I often tell people like your sort of your ideas and your thoughts are downstream from the content you consume, whether it's reading books or watching videos or like social media use, whatever it is, or whatever you surround yourself with, that's where your ideas come from. The people you speak to, that kind of stuff. Yeah, your peer group, all of that stuff. You have to be aware of that, and you have to curate that. You have to be an active participant in that. And so, yes, it is confusing, but you can also remove a lot of the confusion for yourself by like selecting where you get your information from. There's obviously a lot of ways you can produce hypertrophy, and sometimes doing some of these different variations and stuff is definitely fun. I actually really like that a lot of people explore different variations of doing things, because we do tend to get a bit stuck in like that very old school mindset of, the bench press, the squat, and the deadlift. Those are the three foundations for anybody who needs to weight train. They're not bad movements, just like you don't have to do them. So I like challenging that, but I also think that like let's really get down to it. Like, what are some exercises that target the muscle and are easy to progress that you can do without too much setup, etc., too much fatigue, all that kind of stuff. And you do just come back to a lot of your fundamental movements that way. That's why an RDL or a squat or whatever is such a fundamental movement, because it ticks all those boxes. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel on that front for sure. And so I do get a lot of people who come in and perhaps they are a bit surprised by how simple on paper the programs I write for them are. I have a sort of philosophy that the sort of thinking and the theory behind why we do things, the planning is complex, but the actual practice of it is simple. And so on paper, you're going to see something fairly straightforward, fairly simple. The reasoning behind it, though, is pretty complex. And that's how it should be, I think, because then it's just easier to execute. It doesn't need to be complex on paper, really. So I suppose to answer your question, like, yeah, you definitely see more of that. It's got its pros and cons. I suppose as coaches, it's just our responsibility to make sure we understand and communicate why we are doing things, but then keep it simple enough that the client can actually execute properly.
I'm interested to hear how you feel like just social media in general and the access to it has affected your coaching experience, because you've been a coach for 15 years or 15 years plus now. I've only ever been in the fitness industry when phones have been what they are now, right? And I wonder, because I speak to my clientele, the younger ones especially, about the struggles they're having with the big habits, like sleep, nutrition. And it seems like one of the big challenges is literally just keeping focus away from, staying up late on your phone all the time, or, training, but being on your phone for the whole time during a session. Do you feel like it's made a change in the challenges that you're facing with your clients?
Yeah, I think so. But I also think my clients are pretty open to working on their their psychology or their mental approach to how they train. So like a lot of them are pretty open to actually using a pen and paper to track their sessions, or to actively have less phone use, and to maybe even do some journaling or some mindfulness work or things like that, which I think's helpful for a lot of people. It's definitely changed. When I started in the industry, it was kind of like just when Facebook was starting to take off, you know, so it's like it feels very, very long ago. It's a different world. I mean, like I went through high school without any social media, which just seems kind of crazy. Actually, we had a bit of MySpace, but that was it. So it's definitely different. I don't mind, like I don't mind it, because I do think the people are better informed now. If I think back to when I was first coaching people, just how clueless they were around physical culture, it's kind of mind-boggling that people could go through life and just have these weird ingrained ideas. At the same time, you obviously get some other weird ingrained ideas starting to like become more of a thing because of social media, and because you get exposed to these same like strange ideas over and over and over again. So yeah, it's got its pros and cons. It's definitely changed a bit, like the type of questions I field and this kind of thing. But I also kind of remind myself that in our little corner of the internet, we're actually very, very small compared to the general population, you know? So I think I made this mistake at sort of in the middle of my career, where I kind of thought that everyone was on the same page as like the evidence-based coaching movement, if that makes sense. And you kind of realize that like the entire corner of that industry is probably dwarfed by the number of people who visit, you know, bodybuilding.com or whatever. It'd probably be some TikTok account now has more reach than like the entire evidence-based like community combined. You know what I mean? And you sort of get sucked into your little chamber, your little echo bubble. So yeah, like it's definitely the sort of attention span thing I get, but I also think if you create a compelling enough reason for people to pay attention to what you're doing, in terms of like they have buy into their program and this kind of stuff, then you don't have to worry so much about attention span and that sort of thing. But you know, as far as like phone use and stuff goes during sessions and that sort of stuff, I think there's benefit in not using it. There's research showing that reduces exercise performance. I certainly feel more focused when I don't use my phone in between sets and so on. I've even thought about like, am I doing my clients a disservice by delivering my programs on an app, because then they're using their phone to enter their stuff in? It's always tempting to just swipe across to Instagram or TikTok or whatever. Should I not be doing that? I mean, look, at the end of the day, I don't know if there's much I can do about it anyway, so I don't worry about it too much. But certainly the landscape's quite different now with the rise of social media. And unfortunately, I think a lot of it is now being driven by younger people with less qualifications on TikTok, from what I've personally seen. And that's a bit of an issue, I think. But I don't really know what you do about it, to be honest.
Luke, there's one thing I'm consistently finding, and I think it comes back to the expectancy bias that we were just talking about. Have you found this augments the expectations of the client, considering that they're delving into a lot of this content that's coming from TikTok, you know, short form content? I've personally found, I had a client come to me late last year and he was hell bent on excessive amounts of volume. I talked to him a lot about the maximum recoverable volume for a natural athlete and what it says about in the literature. How are you kind of trying to, and have you had the same experience, but how have you kind of had to cut through that? Have you had that instance with any clients where you've had to work through that?
Yeah, all the time, all the time. It sounds very familiar. Yeah, it's hard. I've come to the point where I view myself as a consultant. And so, especially because most of the clients I work with are probably 70% of them are coaches. And so I sort of view my role as providing an external viewpoint that's outside of theirs, you know, so it's like sort of less of their biases coming into play in the decision making, and providing my experience and my knowledge with which they can then make a decision. And so if I give them the options and the knowledge, and I explain the pros and cons and the why and all this kind of stuff, and they still say, you know what, I still want to do this really high volume approach, I'm okay with that. That's fine. You know what I mean? I don't think I can make that decision for the client. Now, if they say to me, I want to do the most optimal thing and like I want you to write the program in that way, and then I say this is what you need to do, and then they refuse that, like that might be a different situation. That sounds little bit similar, more similar to what you're talking about. But for me, I'm kind of happy to meet them where they're at and then evolve their viewpoint over time.
Yeah.
You know, I think maybe if you've sort of managed to almost make a compromise there and sort of earn their trust on that, then you can sort of inch towards perhaps trying a very low volume approach and seeing how it goes and almost positioning it to them as an experiment. And then sometimes they go, oh, actually, I really like that. It worked really well or whatever. So I suppose my coaching style is less prescriptive now than it used to be. And for some people, that's not what they want. That's kind of, they want someone to come in and tell them what to do. Like, what's the best thing for me to do? What's the most optimal thing? But I'm less willing to put my foot down on stuff like that and more about providing options, rationale behind them, and then just being like, listen, you can do what you want to do. That's fine. So that's sort of my approach now. But a lot of it, I think, does come down to Socratic questioning. Like you can kind of get people to get there themselves if you can ask them some key questions about like, why do you want to do this? Why do you think it's effective? What do you think is going to happen if you do lower volume? This kind of stuff, and almost have them work through it in their own heads that way. That's an approach that's definitely been more to the forefront. It's sort of motivational interviewing, I suppose. So that definitely helps as well. But you know, you sort of mentioned having prerequisite type of situation for working with you. Like there can be an element of that as well. You know, if there's someone who really wants to use a certain type of training or they want me to do a certain thing as a coach, you know, I'm happy to say, look, I'm probably not the right person for you. If you want that, you can go somewhere else. You know, that's fine. I'm not too fussed about it because ultimately you do also have to have that relationship where like you feel like you're doing the right thing for the client and they feel like they're doing the right thing. You're doing the right thing for them, you know? So if that's not going to happen, then it's probably not the best relationship to have anyway.
So it sounds like you're focusing more on principles over programming, so to speak.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And look, to be honest, as a coach, sometimes you need to dress things up. Sometimes you need to go, we're going to try this new technique. It's really good for whatever. Even though it's probably no more effective than doing some other technique, but you know, that also facilitates buy-in and gets the client excited. They put more effort into their program and they get better results anyway.
Like
you know, there is an element of that as well.
Way. Yeah.
Yeah. You almost have to have some showmanship to it without being deceitful. So
yeah.
You mentioned buy-in, and one of the, I think, key components to buy-in that you talk about, which I haven't heard many other coaches talk about, is the importance of establishing values or understanding your client's values. It's something that I have definitely tried to implement. Because as I said, I haven't heard many people talk about the way that you talk about it. It's not just simple as, oh, I value a challenge or I value looking big. Like it's a lot more holistic than that.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's key. I think it's really key. And look, some people are not really into it. Some people are coming to you and they're like, look, mate, I just wanted to get some more ideas on how I can get bigger quads, you know. That's fine. But there's sort of fundamental to our overall well-being, and because training and nutrition and lifestyle stuff has lots of different decisions you can make and different paths you can make that could be effective, for me it's pretty key to understand your personal values, because then your decision making is better. You know, if we have the option of, oh, should we, you know, train 5 days a week or 4 days a week? Should we do more volume or less volume and stuff? Like that stuff is easier to make a decision on if you understand what your values are. If you're saying to me that you really value time with your family and stuff as well as the training, then hey, mate, 5 days a week is not a good idea. Like, to give a very, very simple example. So I think it's pretty key. And one of the issues I find is a lot of people have an idea about what they want to do with their training and nutrition, and then they sort of shoehorn values into that. So it's like you said before, I try and ask people sometimes what their values are, and they've already told me they want to lose fat or whatever. And so they'll go, you know, this extreme diet is really good for me because like I value challenge. Okay. But maybe the challenge for you is actually not giving into doing an extreme diet. Like that was one of my things. Like I like challenging myself as well. And in my work, for example, I used to view working 70-hour weeks as discipline, right? But I actually realized it's easier for me to work 70-hour weeks than it is for me to pull back and work 30-hour weeks. And so for me, the discipline really actually came in working less than working more. So, sometimes they're a little bit counterintuitive, and people just kind of shoehorn what they're already doing or what they think they want into a value. But it's really worth looking at. And I suppose that's also another reason why, for me, the training has become more time efficient. It's 3 days a week. It's doing a bit more cardio, that kind of stuff, because I realized that there are other things in life that are important to me too. My hobbies, my family, this kind of stuff. And for my overall well-being, I needed to pay attention to that as well. One of the worst things that happens in this industry, unfortunately, is that people do get great results. They do, build discipline and challenge themselves and this kind of stuff. But then they end up with a situation where one of their values is their health and their discipline and challenging themselves, which is great. And fitness and nutrition and stuff can provide that for you. But if it's taking up literally 70% of your mental bandwidth, then guess what? Your hobbies, your family, your career, all these other things necessarily are reduced. And so it's not about, not pursuing those things in your fitness. It's not that fitness cannot provide discipline or challenge or anything like that. It's just that it needs to be balanced. So yeah, long story short, it's key, because I don't think you can really make good long-term decisions in how you set up your training and your nutrition and lifestyle stuff without really understanding values, to be honest.
So how would you suggest, say, a listener who feels like they don't even have the self-awareness to determine their values, let alone implement them into their, program? How would you suggest they start with that?
There's a few different things. So one of the key ones you can do, there's a book called The Happiness Trap by a guy called Russ Harrison, and he developed this sort of talk therapy called acceptance and commitment theory or therapy. And it's a branch of cognitive behavioral therapy. So if you go to talk therapy, you visit a psychologist, most of them will use some form of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is really just being aware of your thoughts and your feelings and then sort of dealing with them logically, I suppose. Now, acceptance and commitment theory has a really big emphasis on values because it helps us understand how we should behave in different situations. Acting in accordance with your values is not often easy, but it's sort of like doing the worthwhile thing. And so it brings you this sort of longer term satisfaction. And so there are some worksheets. If you look up Russ Harris and the Happiness Trap, he's got a bunch of worksheets. There's a lot of other people who have also developed this kind of thing, but there are sort of some key areas of your life that you can look at, and you can think about who you want to be in those areas. So for example, you can think about your health, you can think about family, career, hobbies, relationships, spirituality. You can various sort of exercises here. For example, you could rank how important each of those things are for you out of 10, and then you can give yourself a mark out of 10 on how well you are sort of acting in accordance with those values. So let's say, for example, I say family is important to me, and I can give a brief description as to why or how it's important to me. So as an example, for me, family is important. I want to be a patient father, as an example. Like that was one of the key words that came up for me, was like, I want to be patient and I want to provide my kid with a lot of opportunities. So then I can say, okay, well, that's very important to me. It's a 10 out of 10. And how well in the last month have I acted in as a patient parent who's providing my kid a lot of opportunities? Maybe I give myself a mark of like, well, it was pretty good, but I could be better. It's 7 out of 10. Okay, so now I have some actions. Like, what actions am I going to take now to bring that from a 7 to a 10? You can do that in a bunch of different areas of your life. Another thing you can do is to just look at a big list of values and identify the ones that are most important to you. And usually I would recommend picking, like there's probably going to be a lot, like a lot of people would say, oh, travel and discovery and challenge and discipline, all these things are important to me. Okay, fine. But let's pick sort of the top 3 or 4 that are the most important to you right now. Which ones would you rank like a 9 or a 10 out of 10? And then once you've picked those, you can then again go through that process of like, okay, how am I expressing these values? So I say travel is important to me. Well, how do I express that? Do I go on a trip often? Do I research different areas that I want to go to? Do I help other people plan their travel? Like these sorts of things. And how can I improve on that to act more in accordance with my values? And so what you'll find is that, you know, there are some things that are going to, some values that you can express through fitness, things like challenge and discipline, or, you know, self-confidence, or, you know, lots of different stuff. Can be creativity, can be expressed through your programming in fitness, for example. Like there's lots of different ways you can do that, but there's also going to be other areas of your life and your general lifestyle where you might need to actually pull back on your fitness or make fitness less of an emphasis so that you can fit those values in. The three questions that I found the most helpful for myself were, number one, if you won the lottery, let's say it was like stupid amount, let's say it's $100 million, and now it's 5 years later, so you've gone on your spending spree, you've bought 28 Ferraris, like you've got a yacht, all this sort of stuff, right? What do you do now? So money's not an obstacle for anything anymore, but what are you filling your days with now? It can't be buying another Ferrari because you're over it by now, right? So that helps you understand something that's meaningful in your life. The second thing is, imagine it's your 100th birthday or your eulogy if you're that way inclined. And what do you want people to say about you? You could write a literal speech if you wanted to. What do people say about you? What type of person were you? Right. So that's another thing. And then the third one is to look at people you admire and what do you admire about them. So I'll give a personal example. One of the people that I admire is the musician Nick Cave. He's actually, both of his sons have died, but one of his sons, I didn't realize about the second one until I Googled it recently, but one of his sons was sort of walking around some cliffs or something near their home when he was 15, and he fell and he died. And the sort of courage to persist through that, and the sort of the creativity that was born out of that in Nick's next album was something that I really admired. So that's just something that I admire about him. And maybe that's something that I want to reflect in my own life. Like there's a reason why I feel drawn to that for some reason. And so it's probably something to do with my values. Another way I like to do that is also to look at the people I don't admire. I don't admire, or the anti-heroes. I hate Gary Vee. I can't stand him. The hustle culture, I just feel so antagonistic towards the bloke. So what don't I like about him? And obviously I want to be the opposite of that. So those are all some examples of how you can get at these values that make it a little bit more accessible and a bit more practical. So yeah, it takes a bit of time to work through those, but I think it's worth doing.
Again, relating this a bit more practically to your own clients, based on what we just discussed, do you think that we're guilty of setting goals before we take the time for introspection on what's actually important to us before we set goals? And maybe that's something we can utilize with our clients.
Massively, because values aren't goals, but goals are sort of little landmarks on the way towards your value. So I like to think of it of like, if I was driving from Perth to Sydney, I know the general direction I need to go in. That's the value, right? But there's going to be a route that I need to take along the way. And those are the goals. So first we're going to stop here, then we're going to overnight here, then we're going to, then we need to pick up this so we can make it through this area. Like we need some water for this, we need a satellite radio, whatever. So that is to say the goals actually come from the value. If you weren't driving, if you didn't know that you were going to Sydney, there's no way you could map out a route to get there, right? And so the values drive the goal setting. And so I agree with you that the goals are often sort of arbitrarily chosen, or they're not thought through. So people might say, I want to lose a certain amount of weight so that I can sort of feel good on the beach or whatever. But it's kind of like, okay, but what are you really driving at here? Like what's the value in this? And that's often the reason why people aren't successful with their fitness goals in the longer term, because they aren't really acting in accordance with their values, because they're not really sure what their values are. They're not really sure what values directed behavior is for them. Now, the problem with this whole thing is that you need buy-in to start with. Like people need to buy into this. Like I can tell there's probably going to be some people listening to this being like, mate, this is just way, like you're trying to be too deep. It's real esoteric. Like who gives a shit? All this kind of stuff. And that's fine. If you're not into it, you're not into it. But ultimately, to try and get someone at the start of their journey to do this stuff can be challenging. it is something that I do with my clients. Like I ask them to go through and do exercises to figure out their values at the very start of us working together, because I often found I would get 6 or 8 weeks in with a client and then go, shit, we've got to make a decision about where we're going to go here. And it would be really helpful to understand what your values are. So I do it at the start now. But a lot of them are like, mate, I know what I want. Like, I just want to understand a bit more about programming. Like, I don't really want to do this whole values thing. And that's fine too. So that is the challenge, is it takes a bit of work. It takes, like, introspection's not necessarily easy. So, but to answer your question, we are missing that. You need to do the introspection. You need to do this sort of clarity, I suppose, get this clarity so that you understand what goals to set.
That links in pretty well with mindfulness as well, mindfulness practice, I think, especially when you're talking about the attitudes towards that. Because like I'm a bit of a bro, I guess a gym bro, pretty standard gym bro. I love training, you know. But I discovered mindfulness quite a few years ago, and it's helped me in my practice, in work, but also in training, in my habits outside the gym. It's helped me a lot with self-awareness, and it's something that I know, even in research, it has plenty of research to back it up, as Hayden will go into in a bit, I think. But sometimes it's hard to get that through to certain people when I'm like, man, they could really, if they did mindfulness practice 10 minutes a day, this person would like go next level. They really need this. But people have those preconceived ideas around those types of things, like values or like mindfulness being like, it's, a bit too deep, or it's not really in line with what they want.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. And like, there's definitely preconceptions when you say mindfulness. Unfortunately, that's how it is. Like, mindfulness can be a lot of things. It can literally be, just focusing on how your body's moving when you're in the gym. That's mindfulness, right?
Yeah.
Like you can go for a walk without any music and just pay attention to how your body's feeling when you walk. That's mindfulness. So you mentioned the phrase self-awareness. I mean, that's kind of what it is. But it's a very helpful thing to develop. It's a helpful thing from the sort of more macroscopic, like we're looking at values kind of thing that's going to direct our life. But also on a more micro level, if you can cultivate mindfulness, guess what? Like your exercise technique gets better. Your how in tune you are with your satiety cues gets better. You enjoy your food more because you're paying attention to it when you eat, this kind of thing. So it's definitely worth doing. And then also it helps you deal with challenging emotions. Like if you can identify emotions that you're feeling, if you can recognize that they're not going to last forever and this kind of stuff, which is, again, cognitive behavioral therapy, it's mindfulness. That stuff is so key to dealing with, being stressed when you're on a diet or whatever it is. So like even down to just the actual mechanics of going through training and dieting, all the way up to the level of the direction of your life, like the mindfulness is a key part of that. But when you say mindfulness, people think that they have to meditate or they have to journal or something like that. And it's not necessarily true. Those are different ways of doing mindfulness, but it's not the only way. So yeah.
Yeah. Those walks you mentioned, going on like a mindfulness walk, so to speak. I remember I heard you mention that in a not check-in. Oh God, my coaching brain. In a podcast a while ago. Yeah, I heard you mention it in a podcast quite a while ago, and I started implementing it because I was just starting out as a PT. I was pretty stressed out. I was always on my phone as well. And I found that to have, just implementing that at least once a week, no music, no podcasts, to have a really profound impact on my mindfulness, how present I was, but also my stress as well.
Three-pronged kind of benefit. Like you're getting like we talked about, the mindfulness, but also improvements in your glucose metabolism, just blood flow as well. Like there's a lot of good benefits of going on a walk, but I think the beauty of being out in the open, taking some time to yourself and reflecting on your thoughts.
Yeah, man. I think walking is just hugely underrated, honestly.
Yeah, there's actually some research by the Baker Institute in 2011. I know it's a long time ago, but it was quite an impactful paper. The research was conducted by the Baker Institute into diabetes, and what they found was that if people went for, I think it was a 2-minute walk at 15 to 20-minute intervals after eating a meal, so their postprandial blood glucose levels would be reduced by about anywhere between 25 to 28%. And I imagine that would have knock-on effects to if you went through the literature, like psychology as well, and how that improves anxiety and stress management.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something there, and yeah, the simple walk, I'm like big fan for all of those reasons. I mean, you're getting like potentially outdoor, like if you're in nature, especially, it's going to help a bit with the sort of stress management. You got the blood glucose management. You got a bit of time to yourself. Maybe getting some vitamin D. Like, yeah, there's a lot going on there. But I do think you can supercharge those walks by reducing the sort of distractions, you know, the podcasting, the listening to music, that kind of stuff it's obviously a helpful time to do it. But I do find that then it's just more sort of mental noise. Um, you know, if you find this situation where you're getting to night or, you know, especially before bed and your mind's kind of racing a bit, it's like, mate, you've been stimulating your brain the whole time. It's the only time that it's actually been quiet in your head for your brain to just process your thoughts and your emotions and just to, you know, consolidate everything that's happened to you that day. And unfortunately, we're in a situation where, okay, we're working, we're training, we are listening to podcasts, we're listening to music, we've got social media. There's no time for that to happen until we put everything down at the end of the day. So yeah, that's where that sort of mindfulness walk came in. It was like, hey, let's just not do that stuff for a bit and just walk and just let the mind do its thing. And that helps a fair bit, I find.
Yeah, and if you're a gym bro listening to this right now, and you're like, you can't really relate to this, or you can't see how it will help. Uh, I've noticed when I try and implement those moments of mindfulness in my day and actually practice doing that, it becomes a lot easier to step into the gym and switch over to uh, that more aggressive kind of state of
Yeah.
mind and have a lot more focus when you're not so busy, because you don't realize you're busy all the time until you're actually, you know, clear-minded and clear-headed and go in with focus and intent. It can make a big difference to the quality of your sessions.
I mean, that's exactly what we spoke about before, where like if you use your phone in between sets at the gym versus not, I think everyone's probably had this experience and has that intuitive feeling that the session is much better because you're more focused. You can give more to your training. And it's the same idea. So I agree with that for sure.
There was a systematic review in or the Clinical Psychology Review journal, Keng et al. 2011. This was on the effects of mindfulness on psychological health. It was a review of empirical studies. Now, this had over 3,700 references, so it was quite a big review. One of the papers that was cited in this review, Brown and colleagues, they found that trait mindfulness, so that's a characteristic of the individual, has been associated with much higher levels of life satisfaction. So it's less about the actual individual developing those skills or habits, but more so associated with their personal characteristics. There is a lot of research that shows this link between mindfulness and improved performance on tasks, whether it be sustaining attention or persistence, and how this links in with something like bodybuilding and adhering to a training program or a nutrition plan. Aside from those walks, are there any other techniques you've used to facilitate your clients developing mindfulness?
Yeah, you know, the challenging thing about mindfulness as well is that it is difficult to define. Like,
Yeah.
people obviously think of meditation, but we don't actually really know what sort of techniques or implementations of mindfulness are most effective. Like, we don't, or what can, I suppose, increase your personal capacity the most. Like, it's a very difficult area to research because it's kind of all over the place. And obviously, a lot of it is coming from ancient traditions and so on. So I personally find that the things that, like, in the same way that you can kind of practice and get better at a movement or any other skill, having awareness around your thoughts, cognitive distortions, which I'll explain in a second, um, emotions, that sort of stuff you can get a lot better at. And so I think that that's building that sort of intrinsic mindfulness, if you want to put it that way, within people. And so that's not just meditation necessarily, but it is paying attention to the thoughts and sensations that you have. And you can do that a lot of different ways. I mean, mindfulness meditation is one way you could do it. You can also just sort of make an effort to be more aware of those things. You can do things like journaling and this kind of stuff.
Yep.
What I mean by cognitive distortions is that we all have, I suppose, I kind of call them bugs in the software. It's just like, I suppose, things that have come out of evolution that that help our brain sort of make sense of the world. Things like black or white thinking, blowing things out of proportion, this and that. Those are all like examples of cognitive distortions. And when you recognize them in your own thoughts, you can't stop them, but when you recognize them in your own thoughts, it becomes much easier to deal with them. And so I think that that really builds that sort of personal capacity when you can recognize those things happening. It's almost like your pattern recognition gets better. Like I know that when I'm trying to put my kid to sleep, I tend to get into this very like negative headspace sometimes, and I can recognize when that's happening now because I've done the work on like, oh, I'm blowing this out of proportion. It's not really a big deal if she goes to bed 15 minutes later, or this feels like an eternity, but I know it's only been 5 minutes of me sitting here while she's been crying. You know, those kinds of things. So that helps a lot. But I think it's probably also individual. Like I've spoken to some people who really enjoy journaling because it helps them get thoughts out of their head and onto paper and gives some structure to them so they can actually understand what it is that they're thinking and feeling and maybe not ruminate on it so much in their head. Other people are just not really that into it, and they find other techniques work as well. So
yeah, for me, it's a really weird one, but it's driving. Like sitting in the car, I just turn the radio off or whatever and just sit
yeah,
there and focus on my breathing. And when I stop at the light,
yeah, dude, I love it. I mean, you got to find that stuff. And so, I think people can probably get quite creative with it. You know, I know some people who they knit, and so you get in that same like just repeated mechanical action that you kind of don't have to think about after a while, and that works for them as well. But there's actually also good research on just things like identifying your emotions. So, like if you are getting some kind of negative feeling or whatever in a situation, just kind of understanding, like, hang on, what is it exactly that I'm feeling here? Oh, okay, I'm angry because of this or whatever. And just even just naming it is actually quite a good way of implementing this, because then you sort of start to understand what it is exactly you're feeling and perhaps why you're feeling it as well. And that can then tie into recognizing the cognitive distortions and that kind of thing too. So I find that's quite a helpful technique as well. This comes into a lot of so with some clients, I work quite a lot on their sort of their body image, and it's sort of a natural follow on from, you know, someone who's been in the fitness industry their whole lives, become a coach, bikini competitor, doing way too much volume, dieting way too hard. What do I do now to continue to improve? Actually, hang on, why do I want to do this? Oh shit, like I'm not self-confident in my body. Oh my God, like this kind of thing. You can you start to work on it from there. But one of the things with body image is actually just understanding exactly what you're feeling and identifying your emotions. So if you're sort of in a situation where you're like, I feel fat today or whatever, well, sorry, fat's not an emotion. So what exactly are you feeling? I'm feeling a bit shy today because I can feel my stomach pushing against my shirt or something like that. I'm very aware of that area. Things like that, you know, that can start to actually be a form of mindfulness. And as you start to deal with those things, it gives you practical solutions. Okay, so maybe don't wear your tightest clothing today. You feel a bit better about yourself. Things like that, you know. So it can go that route too.
And that's actually a skill, a technique used in certain forms of meditation as well. Just
Yeah.
labeling, labeling those emotions, because then it gives you that space. You're not in that emotion. You're not swept up in it. It gives you that space to at least be aware of it, and then you can start thinking, all right, this is what's going on. How can I address this?
Yeah, I think becoming a bit more third person is very helpful. Sometimes I tell my clients to kind of coach themselves through a situation, like imagine they were the coach, or imagine they, in that situation, they're talking to their best friend or something. Like, how would you treat your best friend if your best friend had just quote unquote blown their diet because they, you know, ate a whole box of donuts or something? How would you treat your best friend in that situation? Well, you'd be kind to them, surely. You tell them, hey, it doesn't matter. You can get back on your diet straight away. Like, no need to punish yourself for this, that kind of stuff. And you can coach yourself through, and it's almost like a third person technique that way. There is some research even looking at literally going into the third person, and like I might sort of talk to myself by saying, oh, Luke noticed that he's feeling frustrated today because he couldn't get to the gym. Like, it feels very strange, but it actually does work. So yeah, it is interesting.
I suppose that's why journaling would be helpful as well.
Yeah.
Kind of linked to that.
Yeah. I think the next thing I want to talk to you a bit about is on that goal setting topic. One of the books I've read, no doubt some of the listeners have read, James Clear's Atomic Habits.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that book, he states that we do not rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. So I know you've got a strong emphasis on goal setting and values. James Clear is very much the opposite. He's goals are important, but he says what's more important than goals is having strong habits or strong systems. And he also talks about how you want to do the most painful thing first, because after that, your attention wanes, and that's when we have those attention lapses. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally find that technique pretty helpful too, to get those things out of the way first. There's a book that I never read, but I always remember the title of, Eat the Frog. If you got to eat a frog,
Yes. Okay.
just do it. Like, don't, if you've got to do it, don't extend the pain of anticipating eating a frog any longer than you have to. I quite like some of the stuff that James writes, but I also find that in Atomic Habits, he was kind of like, oh, to form a habit, just do the thing that you want to be a habit. Like, there was no, it was sort of circular logic, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of the research that I'm reading seems to be going in the other direction. So
yeah,
there is this study here by Australia and colleagues published last year, the effects of goal setting on sustained attention and attention lapses. And what this research is actually highlighting is that if you set specific goals and the difficulty of these goals kind of progresses over time, it sustains your attention. Task unrelated thoughts are reduced. James Clear is saying that goal setting isn't as important, but maybe there's almost like a translation there that he's not considering the minor steps or that you take towards a longer term goal.
right.
I feel like he's talking about, short-term actionable goals versus long-term goals, but he's not calling those short-term actionable goals in a lot of cases almost.
Yeah. The current results of this paper suggest that goal setting techniques can help individuals better sustain their attention and reduce their attention losses. And this is just as exercise. There's plenty of literature that shows exercise has those benefits as well. Last week, we spoke with Brandon Kempter, who's a natural professional bodybuilder, and we were talking a little bit about the enhanced athletes and the natural athletes. Now, we know that when enhanced athletes start taking PEDs, there's a whole host of other side effects that come with these drugs that can influence their psychology in a number of different ways. In your experience, have you worked with both natural and enhanced athletes? And I guess what kind of challenges might present themselves from that mindfulness standpoint between these two types of athletes when you sort of throw pharmacology into the mix?
Yeah, I have worked with both for sure. I think it does come down to the individual a little bit. I personally haven't noticed like massive psychological differences in terms of, like, I wouldn't be able to separate it. Like, is this the person's personality, or is this as a result of them using drugs of some sort? But certainly it does tie back to what we were talking about with the values and stuff of, if you're at the point where you want to use pharmacology to continue to enhance your physique, like, is this aligned with your values or not? And I think perhaps that once you've sort of committed to a pharmacological route, there's a tendency to justify it, if that makes sense. So people tend to kind of double down on some of those strategies that they've been using, psychological strategies to just like, I got to get to the goal kind of thing. And it's almost like I'm in with both feet now. So I'm going to keep moving towards this goal no matter what. So there is a different psychological profile, I would say, to someone who's made that decision. And I'm not saying it's a good or bad decision. I'm just saying that that's what I've seen with a lot of people. So it is pretty interesting. You know, what we were talking about with the James Clear thing, maybe about having that structure in place and stuff. I think that what I see with people who have gone down the pharmacological route is they tend to be much less psychologically flexible in that they have a very strong routine and structure around their training and nutrition, which gets them great results. And often it is, you know, something that people need to work on to get better at. But sometimes it kind of leans too far into that sort of rigidity. And then they find that other areas of their life are kind of lacking a little bit. And sometimes I even think that having a little bit more flexibility there would actually get them better physique goals in a lot of ways. Because they would then potentially, you know, have more meals out. They would maybe spend more time with their friends or on their hobbies, which then gives them better recovery capacity, for example, because they're less stressed now. Like it kind of does actually tie into their results as well. So that's something that I've noticed quite a lot with people who have taken that extra step. It's not exclusive to them, of course. It just seems to be a little bit more common. So yeah, definitely a little bit different in my experience, but how much of it is due to the actual pharmacology itself would be very, very interesting to know, but I'm not really sure.
What we talked about was kind of like when bodybuilding actually becomes an unhealthy pursuit. It starts off with this. And so the literature is saying, and there's been several studies published between 2018 and 2020 that have shown the benefits of resistance training for processing speed, executive functions, attention, inhibitory control, and just as you mentioned there, that mental flexibility. So it often they would commence resistance training and they're getting these benefits of improved mental flexibility. And then once they start taking these PEDs, it almost flings them to the other side of the.
It could be like a chicken or the egg situation as well. Like, are they going down that path of getting really serious, like taking all these PEDs because they are so rigid and focused on it in the first place?
Yeah.
Or is that
Yeah. I think there. I mean, I'm not that up to date on the literature. I don't know how well researched this is, but there are structural changes to the brain with the administration of testosterone, for example, beyond physiological ranges. So is that having an effect? I don't know. Perhaps.
Mike Israetel has said on social media, YouTube videos, he said that when he started taking testosterone and various exogenous drugs, that he had serious anxiety, serious issues maintaining his mental state of mind. So,
and different compounds also have varying levels of neurotoxicity as well.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not a PD expert, but from what I've heard from people who are a bit more knowledgeable than me, a lot of like the oral stuff and things like tren tend to be a little bit more neurotoxic and just send your head a bit crazy.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, like it's a good overall point that just, you know, again, it comes back to those like how far do you push down a certain route before it starts to actually affect you negatively. And sometimes we get so far into something and it has given us so much in our lives that we are sort of a bit blind to it. I think I was probably like that with training until I kind of realized like, yeah, dude, I'm kind of maxing out what I'm capable of here naturally. Like, what's the next step here? Am I willing to take that step? Probably not. So what the fuck am I doing with my training now? Like, what do I do now? So I've been there, but I think for a long time I was probably already there, but just kind of ignored it because I was like, no, what I'm doing is healthy. Like, I'm training well. I'm paying attention to my food. It's better to be muscular than not muscular. It's sort of very black and white thinking. You know, and so probably a lot of us in this industry are in the same way. And I do speak to a lot of people that are like, oh, you know, training's my escape and it is my relaxation. And it's like, yeah, it can be, but probably when you're training 7 days a week for 2 hours at a time, it's probably not. So just from a physiological perspective, at least. So yeah, it's interesting to think about.
smashing 400 milligrams of caffeine at 7 p.m. as well.
Yeah, well, exactly. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I was saying to Aiden before we jumped on here was I was listening to that one of your podcast episodes where you were talking a bit about 10 simple rules for reading a scientific paper. When I was listening to this earlier today, the reason that I wanted to talk about it so much is because I think it's a really important thing to discuss in the context that we're in at the moment. This podcast that we're bringing you onto is very much about cutting through the misinformation that's on social media. People can be more informed and more critical of the content they're consuming, is understanding where to get their information from, which sources of information are reliable and valid. But by the same token, if someone goes on to Google Scholar, opens up any journal database, it can be quite intimidating for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Unless they've got the tools and skills to understand how to process and understand that information. I was just pulling up a paper that I stumbled upon, quite funny. But the title of this paper, it's by Martin Bushite, Magnitudes Matter More Than Beetroot Juice. And so in the conclusion of this, basically just to summarize, and his closing remarks are, I believe it is important to come to people with the right message. And in this case, applying some appropriate stats surely helps. And so he's focused a lot on avoiding papers where they only publish the p-value in their results and focusing more on the effect sizes and Cohen's d. I think that's a nice way to kind of lead into what I want to talk about now, which is like the amount of accumulated knowledge that we're getting online. How do we actually interpret research papers to be more informed individuals when we go back onto social media and so forth?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think especially in today's day and age, it's important to understand that as a practitioner, if you're trying to make the best call based on the evidence available, you're looking at the bulk of the evidence. And I don't think a lot of people realize that point, because there's so many, like you can get one piece of evidence for just about anything.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean the paper's good. It doesn't mean, that most of the evidence is suggesting that. So yeah, I think it's a useful way.
How do you scrutinize those texts? What kind of things can we look for? Do you want to maybe just, in a simple fashion as possible, maybe just step us through a handful of those rules and what people should start to think about when they're looking at reading journal papers and getting their information?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I think unless you kind of do it as part of your job, it's very difficult to actually interpret research well, like unless you are doing a research review and you've got some expertise in statistics or whatever, or you've done a master's where a big part of it is looking at research and stuff, it can be very, very tough. So I don't think it's realistic to expect that you will be an expert on it. It doesn't mean that you can't look at papers or you can't pick out a few things from them, of course. But I guess the first thing is just to understand that, like what's your actual goal? I think that is the first rule in that 10 rules for reading a paper is like, what's your actual reading goal?
Yeah. And then the second one.
So like, are you a researcher looking to analyze a colleague's paper? Probably not. Like, are you just trying to get used to it, trying to orient yourself, this kind of thing? Pick what you're trying to get out of it. Maybe just familiarize yourself with an area of research or something like that. And then understand the actual goal of the paper or the authors as well. Like, what are they trying to do with this? Because one of the big criticisms I see from the general public on research in the health and fitness arena is, oh, this was on untrained people. Oh, this was on animals. This one didn't do this. This one didn't do that. Why didn't they look at this? And the reason why is because we're dealing with a human body and there are millions of variables involved with the human body in a free living situation. You can't study all of it. The point of science is to eliminate as many of those as possible so that we can get some clearer answers. And so when you understand that some papers are just looking to establish a potential mechanism and then be built on by a subsequent paper, it's like you said, Aiden, like there's not one paper that's trying to give us the answer to everything. What they're trying to do is provide a little bit of context each time, right? And so you take, okay, there's 10 papers, some of them looked at this aspect, some of them looked at that aspect. They're all moving in the same direction. Okay, now we can say with more confidence what's going on. So those are kind of like the mindset, at least, to go into is, what is your goal? What's the author's goal? What's the actual like point of this study? What are they trying to do? They're probably not trying to give you an individual prescription of how many reps you should do or how many sets you could do. That's what most papers are not looking at that. So that's the first thing. And, you know, from there, I think you also have to understand how that fits into the greater context of the discussion. Like, how does this fit into anecdotal evidence? How does it fit into received wisdom, you know, things that we've always done? How does it fit into other scientific research, or what a textbook says, or what an author says, or what a podcast you heard says? How do all of those things come together? Because as I've sort of mentioned earlier on, I think right at the start of the podcast, like how I view my role as being in between the research and the actual end user, there's sort of a spectrum there, you know? So like some of us are trying to communicate science in a practical way to people, and that's not really what papers are trying to do. Like research papers are not trying to do that. They're not trying to create some kind of individual prescription or to end up in the end user's hand where they can then write a program with it or anything like that most of the time. So you have to kind of understand where it fits into the greater discussion of like, okay, you know, a podcast episode is trying to maybe give some more practical discussion around how we actually do things in the gym. Someone on social media is trying to give a very specific, limited context of how something might be applied, whereas a research paper is trying to be like fairly broad and put it into the literature as a whole, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of like how I view looking at papers in general. Generally speaking, I think some of the other rules, if I remember right, were to obviously be critical of the paper itself, but also to be kind, like to understand that the researchers have set things up in a certain way and they are generally subject matter experts. So there must be a reason why they're doing things a certain way, and we should try and think about why they are doing things a certain way. I think one of the rules was also be ready to go the extra mile, like look at the actual graphs, look at the data itself, and what do you think of it? Don't just like scroll to the conclusion. Actually look at the data and go, does this make sense to me? Like, what would I think based on these graphs, on this data? Another rule was to talk about it, to discuss it with other people, because people are going to have different interpretations. And this is where I find research reviews very useful. Part of my practice for understanding research is that I usually look at a paper and I go through and I come to my own conclusion. I bring my own criticisms, my own ideas for it, and then I go to a research review like the Mass Research Review or whatever, and I see what those people have said about it, because they are also experts. They review a lot of papers, and then I can see where the deficits in my knowledge are, or where we differ in opinion or whatever. Like, it's very good to sort of talk about it and discuss it and how that might be interpreted and applied in real life. That's what I can remember off the top of my head from that. But I think it's one of these weird things where I do think that having some kind of scientific literacy is really helpful as a coach, but you also have to understand that your role is not to understand research as well as a researcher is going to understand research. And it's going to take a lot of work if you do want to get to that point. So that doesn't mean don't read the papers, but it does mean understand what your role is and where your limitations are. But I view the role of the coach or the person trying to communicate the science as equally as important as the person who is generating the original research in the first place, even though there might be a bit of a sort of academic hierarchy there, like, oh, I got a PhD and you're just a coach with a Cert 3 and 4. Like, what do you know? Yeah, man, but I'm the one who's working on the floor and having to explain this to my 40-year-old, you know, middle manager at the bank so that he can actually train well. Those roles are kind of equally important at the end of the day. So you got to understand where your role is in that and be able to work within those lines too. So we're not pretending to be smarter than we are, but we're also not undermining our own role in how we communicate on the practical side of things. I think some of the, just to kind of round out, like some of the sort of misconceptions around research as well. Like if you're a coach and you're feeling frustrated about like, well, this research says that and this research says something different, you got to understand that some research is looking to be internally valid. In other words, they're trying to control as many variables as possible so that they can understand what variables are doing what. And some research is more externally valid. In other words, it's closer to a free living situation, because obviously, like, human physiology in a free living situation is endlessly complex, and there are millions of different contexts that it could be applied in. So it's not that useful to just have research that looks at that, because you're not controlling anything then. You may as well not do it then. But the internally valid stuff can't necessarily be applied to external living situations, but it does play a role in trying to control variables. And that's the inherent limitation of doing research in the health and fitness field, is that there's not going to be something that just goes, oh, yes, this is exactly how many sets Aiden should do to grow his chest. Like, it doesn't work that way. Yeah. And at the same time as well, we also have to understand that health and fitness research and sports science research is a young field, and it's very difficult to recruit participants. So as you sort of alluded to before, Hayden, when you're seeing a p-value and something's saying it's significant, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually producing what we would colloquially call a significant result. The effect size isn't that big, which is also something that I mentioned earlier before. You could have something that is statistically significant, but it's only increasing the size of a muscle by 0.2 millimeters over 6 months, which is not visible to the naked eye and virtually worthless to your average person on the street. So is it worth doing it? Like, maybe not, but it is statistically significant. So that's another thing just to kind of bear in mind. So hopefully that gives a bit of an overview.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier one point about looking at research and working out how that fits within our current ideas, how things have always been done, etc. And we spoke to Brandon a couple of weeks ago about one topic in particular, and it's made me think of this. We were talking about the reps in reserve debate, I guess, and
training to failure.
Yeah, and the idea that some research is suggesting is that if we are to leave 1 to 2 reps in the tank, you can get a solid stimulus, but less fatigue means you can get more work done. But then we look at how things have always been done, and I posed this idea to Brendan. I'm like, I look at people who I seem to grow really fast, or people who like the top of the game in bodybuilding, and they seem to train like really, really hard and trying to train as hard as they possibly can all the time. So that's where I posed the question to him: how do you think this new research fits in? And I want to do the same with you as well, because I know you've spoken a little bit about reps in reserve.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's even some research showing that you can get similar results training quite far away from failure, to be honest, depending how much volume you do. And also there's some research that uses velocity loss. So it isn't exactly reps in reserve, but it's kind of like similar results training 1 to 2 reps in reserve compared to like 5 reps in reserve. But long story short, I think it probably comes down to a couple of things. Firstly, the people at the top that are the most muscular, that are the strongest, are by definition outliers.
Yeah.
That's not how most people are going to respond, and it's not how you are going to respond. The second thing is that there obviously is a range of responses. So some people are going to respond better to certain protocols than others. I've had some people who feel quite fatigued when they do even what I would consider moderate volumes, or who get excessively sore by going to failure compared to other people. And the opposite is true as well. So you might get some people who can tolerate 20 sets of going to failure a week fine, and other people who can't at all. So that's part of the issue when you get a report in the literature of what's average, or if you just look at elite bodybuilders, they are not the average person either, and they're not you. So I guess what we know is that there are lots of approaches that work. There's a range of responses. When we look at the science and when we look at the anecdotal evidence, it's more likely that we can predict what the best protocol is for you as an individual, but it's not going to tell us exactly what to do. So my approach is, let's get in the ballpark of what we know is a pretty good recommendation for most people. If I know that most people get better results training closer to failure, then let's start there. And if we notice, oh shit, you're not recovering very well, or we notice like, hey, you seem to be recovering really well and you feel like you can do more, okay, now we can tweak from an individual basis. And that is a bottoms up approach from coaching. It's not top down. Top down is predictive. It's trying to model everything ahead of time. Bottoms up is, let's get in the ballpark. Let's see what the experience is and let's tweak based on that. And I think that's a much better approach. And that's how my coaching approach has evolved over the years as well. So that's kind of where I come at it from. Also knowing that there's a lot more data that is going to come out as people continue to explore these questions.
Yeah. Do you take a auto-regulatory approach with that intensity in terms of reps and reserve? Do you encourage us to do that?
I use it extensively. Yeah. I think it's really important because the other thing is, of course, your recoverability and all this stuff is going to vary. So, you know, for me personally, sometimes when my wife and I swap who sleeps with my 2-year-old, she doesn't sleep that well. So some nights I get 4 hours of broken sleep, and some nights she pretty much sleeps through, and I get like a regular night's sleep. So for me to say, oh, you know, you've got to train to failure 15 sets a week on your chest, mate, it changes day to day. It changes week to week, depending on what's happened. So that's another factor. Like we can assume that on average, you know, this is what your recoverability and everything is going to look like and your readiness to train. But it is variable. So that's another thing that frustrates me about this. Like, what's the ideal volume or how far away from failure should you train and stuff is like, well, mate, it kind of changes. It depends. Like there's probably a range there. In the same way that people think that if I'm tracking my macros and I hit 2100 every day, I'm eating 2100. No, you're not. There's variation in each portion of food that you eat. There's variation in your NEAT every day that you can't account for. But that's okay. It doesn't need to be exact. You can be in a range. And so in the same way, I think that people can be within a range of like how often they train to failure, how many sets they do, all this kind of stuff. And I think you can develop the skills to kind of make that call by yourself on the day. If I'm in the gym and I'm feeling especially good and I go, hey, maybe I could do an extra set, fuck, mate, go for it, you know? Or if I'm really cooked, I'm like, I don't know if I can get through this workout. Okay, well, chop the last exercise off today. Like in the long term, it's probably going to end up being more beneficial for you. And there is some research suggesting that as well. So yeah, that's where I come at it from. Definitely very auto-regulatory and trying to build people's confidence in sort of calling an audible when they need to.
Yeah. Like understanding what failure actually looks like for them too, because if you try to go the RIR approach, I think that's what we're saying to Brandon was it can get a little bit tricky there in terms of actually communicating with your client, because for a lot of people, it can be very different.
It certainly can, but I also, I kind of have two things I want to say on that. The first is that I don't think it has to be 100% accurate. I don't really care if it's 1 rep in reserve or 2 reps in reserve. You know what I mean? People get really stressed about that. I don't think it makes that much difference. The second thing is it's definitely different between people, and it's different between exercises too. Yep. You know, 1 RIR on a squat is pretty different to 1 RIR on a lateral raise. And as long as we have some kind of baseline for the person, it's fine. So I have this concept of like, you don't need to be precise. You can be accurate instead. And so the idea is that I like using macros as an example. If someone is tracking their macros and they're doing a really bad job of it, let's say they're clueless, they don't actually know how to do it properly, they're misweighing everything and all that. And they go, oh, I'm able to lose fat on 5,000 calories a day. That's probably not true. But as long as they're consistent enough, we can say it's fine. And if they stop losing weight, well, you just need to eat less. So let's aim for 4,500 calories now. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's a bit like, okay, you might be counting it incorrectly, but as long as we've got some baseline, a relative change is what's making the difference.
Yeah. It's kind of what I was going to say, Luke, is it's kind of like if you've got a faulty scale, but you're doing a prep. Right. You're doing a prep and you use the same scale every day or every week.
And if it's trending downwards, mate, you're golden. So yeah, long story short, if someone's calling, you know, 1 RIR and I'm looking at it going, that's not really 1 RIR, it's probably more like 3 RIR. It doesn't bother me that much because at least you know, and then you can be like, yeah, sweet, do an extra set or actually go to failure on this one, and then they suddenly do 3 extra reps and you're like, yeah, well, there you go. But like, it's not the biggest deal in the world, I don't think. Like, certainly, is it better to have both precision and accuracy? Sure, but you can kind of work with it. And I often see people get too in their heads about reps and reserve, even to the point of like, well, what are we defining as failure? It's like, mate, we are getting way too into the weeds here. You know what I mean? Like, just fucking train really hard until you're getting very close to being unable to do another rep, and you'll be fine.
I think in one of your podcast episodes I was listening to, you were discussing a similar thing on how often you should vary your exercises, for instance, and like people focusing too much on the finer details and less so on actually drilling down on nailing those exercises that they enjoy, they're good at, and can really progressively overload over time.
Exactly. Exactly. I think like when I say this stuff, it's not that I don't think some of this stuff matters, because I think it can make a difference, but the degree of effort and how like obsessive you have to be over these tiny details for a difference that you can't even measure anyway, for me, it doesn't make sense. Because the problem is when you're working with an individual, you can't really compare stuff. If they go, oh, it feels like I do better with this exercise than that exercise, it's like, that's valid to an extent, but you're not taking the exact same person at the exact same time point and comparing the two. You're either doing one exercise first under certain conditions, or you're doing the other, and then you're doing the other exercise afterwards. They're not running in parallel, so you can actually compare them. So there might be a lot of things that are different. Like if you compare, oh, I did 4 weeks of incline presses with a barbell and then 4 weeks of incline presses with a dumbbell. I feel like dumbbells grew my chest more. Well, like firstly, you can't measure that, but secondly, you're either doing the barbell first and then the dumbbell, or the other way around. You're not doing them in parallel under the same conditions. So you can't actually measure the difference between the two because they're being done under different circumstances. In the second block of training, you might have had less overall stress. You might have been nailing your diet more. You might have been sleeping a bit better. There's lots of variables that you're not accounting for. So that's one of the frustrating things with trying to take that sort of individual approach. And so that's why I think that sometimes when we're trying to really dig down on these fine details, the difference that they make is so small that it's impossible to measure for an individual. And therefore, it's a little bit like, yeah, you could do either way. It's probably fine.
In terms of growing an online business now in such a saturated market, I feel like now there is like the credibility of coaches is coming a lot more back into the spotlight. What do you think has been like the biggest factor in your success as an online coach, and what other insights would you give to any coaches out there?
Yeah, the point of difference with small business is you. It's your personality. It's your unique strengths. It's how you communicate. It's how you interact with people, how you present yourself. It's your hobbies, your other interests outside of fitness. You got to communicate that to people, because you're right. There are a lot of evidence-based coaches out there. Like, it's a saturated industry for sure, but that doesn't mean you can't stand out to a small group of people who end up being your clients. So part of my intake form and part of my coaching application process is asking why people chose me over someone else. And you'll notice I don't have any before and afters on my page. I've never posted before and afters. I've really limited how much I post my own physique. I do get more interaction when I post, my own physique and stuff, but I don't really do it that often. And the reason why people join with me is because they say that I come across as authentic, as holistic. I can explain things in a simple way. In other words, they just kind of like my vibe. You know what I mean? They like the way that I do things. And I recognize very early on that those were my strengths, and I double down on them. In fact, if you're a coach, I recommend picking like 10 different people in different areas of your life. It can be family members, friends, people you know in a professional setting, and ask them, what do you think is like a unique strength of mine? Like, what am I especially good at? I did this with 20 different people, and every single one of them came back with the same thing. And I was saying, you're good at explaining things simply. You come across as authentic, that you actually care about people, this kind of thing. And when you hear that and you understand what your strengths are, you can double down on it, and you got to show that to people, through your content, what you put on your stories and this kind of stuff. And so the mistake that I made early on was trying to look smart and keep things were very complicated. I was posting lots of research. I was using fancy words and this kind of stuff. But really, that wasn't my strength. My strength was being able to explain it in a more simple way, and I needed to double down on that. But the ego was a bit like, oh, I got to show people that I'm really smart, So for coaches, I really recommend doing that. And it might, there might be something that is unrelated to fitness that someone signs up because of. I've had coaches say to me, oh, I literally had a client inquire about coaching because he noticed I was wearing like a Lakers shirt, and they were really into basketball. and they saw I had a Lakers shirt. We had a common interest. So they reached out, we started talking, they ended up signing up as a client. You know, that sort of stuff is how it happens. If you think about how you would get like clients on a gym floor, a lot of it comes from interacting with people on a sort of daily basis in a casual way. Like you can get the odd client by walking up to them being like, hey bro, can I give you a tip on how to like improve your bench press or something? Most people don't really like that. It's a little bit too full on. But the person that you sort of see at the same time every morning and you say hi to them, and then you maybe have the odd conversation that's maybe unrelated to fitness or whatever, those are generally the people that you form a good relationship with. And when they think of a coach, you're the first person they think of because you were friendly to them. They like you. They like your vibe, whatever it is. So that's where I think coaches can double down. And so, of course, you have to have the knowledge. You have to have the expertise. You should keep working on that. But what's going to differentiate you is your sort of personal uniqueness, I suppose.
Yeah, I was actually chatting to Hayden about this literally 5 minutes before we jumped on the podcast about how much personal stuff you should put online. And I said to him, like, yes, obviously you need to be able to provide value, professionalism, things like that. But what kind of sets you apart and makes you relatable is your just the personal things about you, your authenticity. And
yeah,
so I think you should sprinkle some personal stuff in there. And it's a mistake that I think I tried to avoid when I first started my social media. Like I would go out and have a few beers with the boys, you know, and I'd try to avoid showing that because I feel like I'd be worried what people would think of me.
Yeah, same.
But it's authentic to be like, hey, I'm in shape. I value training, but I also value my social life. I can have a beer, and you know that makes you relatable.
Yeah, I mean, you probably noticed my stories are literally what I cooked for dinner and what beer I'm drinking. That's like 90% of what I post there, which I'm sure for some people they would prefer that I post more research breakdowns and stuff. But you know, the people who sign up with me do so because they're like, oh, this is fucking cool that this guy's like into beer and food and stuff, and he's a personal trainer. You know, gives you a point of difference.
Yeah, I guess we were just talking about kind of like the brand strength connect, like the podcast we're creating and what kind of how people want to perceive us as individuals, and we're trying to bridge that gap between research and the practicalities of resistance training and physical activity, and so we've got Eric Helms coming on in 2 episodes, and that's like what we were talking about before. So getting those experts in the space and trying to bridge that gap. It's the image or the reputation that I think about a lot, given how a lot of people's identities are very much attached to their online profiles these days. Like it's a very changing world, you know. So it's the things I was listening to with Chris Williamson in his podcast, Modern Wisdom. I think it's about 10% of, I'll say 10% of your followers will see your content or something of that nature. And then 10% of those people will actually interact or comment. So you don't really get that extrinsic feedback of what they actually want to see or what they like. And we're a very numbers-based society now. Everything's about engagement, interaction. So yeah, I think it's something that we would also like our listeners to, if they've got anything particular they're enjoying about the podcast, or they would like to see more from myself and Aidan, whether it be, you know, more informal chats, content about what we've liked about actually bringing our guests on, like yourself or Brandon or Eric, please reach out, send us a message, because just like you, we're interested in learning and getting better. And I guess that's why it's such a interesting passion project for myself and Aidan. We just want to learn, and we really enjoy this, and I'm having so much fun with it already. So
yeah. Something else as well on that same topic to keep in mind is that, let's take Luke for example. If 50% of his followers like looking at what Swedish beers he's drinking, the other 50% don't really like it. The 50% that aren't interested, they're not going to be like, oh, I'm not going to look at Luke's, you know, research posts anymore because it is beer. They're just going to, they're just not going to take notice.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah, just going to blanket. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so,
but I mean, also you got to think about like, are we chasing likes here, or do we care about the people who are really our people? Which by definition they're not going to be a huge percentage, but they're the ones that count. So I don't really give a shit if I make some great quip that gets 5,000 likes. I would prefer to have a post that really, really speaks to people that I would potentially want to work with as clients, and I only get 50 likes, right? That's what I'm there. That's why I'm on social media. I wouldn't be doing it otherwise. So you also got to bear that in mind. Like sometimes the metrics really mislead you because we chase likes and shares and this kind of stuff, but those aren't necessarily, you know, getting people that you're a great fit for to come to you. So that's just something that you have to fight with as well. I find like I've really had to fight with that as my account grew. It's like, oh, this is doing well. I got to do more of this. But then I realized, oh, actually, these are just things that are very shareable and lots of people are liking them, but they're not people who I actually want to work with as a coach. So, you know, you got to think about that as well. And if you're unwilling to kind of share yourself online, it's like, what's going to happen when someone starts working with you and you got to try and keep up this front of like, oh, I'm a professional personal trainer who has never touched a drop of alcohol. I would never do such a thing. You know, come on.
Yeah. It's just like walking the gym floor, you know, social media.
Yeah.
In trying to get clientele, you know, you need to be yourself, you need to have conversations, you need to be social.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
100%.
Yeah, I was actually gonna take it back just a few things. I kind of let the conversation go because I didn't want to stop the flow, but it was great, great chat. But just in terms of what you were talking about with like talking more about research with someone else or building on your current learnings. I had a chat a couple of weeks back now with, mindset coach called Jeffrey Morgan, and he spent 20 years in prison and he's reformed himself and now he helps other people with their own businesses. And one of the things we were talking about was listening to big influential names within the health and fitness space, like Andrew Huberman, for instance. And we're talking a lot about how if you don't take the time to almost plug out while you're listening in and actioning that information, it's completely useless. And he was talking about some specific ways he does that, whether it be just having like a notepad, jotting down key notes from each podcast you're listening to. One of the things that I found really interesting about what you said was when you read a research paper, actually take the time to write your own review on that paper of what you've actually read. For me personally, that's been like throughout my life, that's been the best way for me to learn. It's just absorbing information. Yeah. You might remember a few things, but actually applying that information.
Yeah. Well, I think like, for example, creating the social media content that I do and stuff has actually helped me quite a lot because you got to somehow distill the ideas that you, So
like writing captions.
I've got these constraints, I've got a caption that's only a certain length. I've got 10 slides or whatever for a carousel, 2 of which are going to be taken up by a call to action and a headline. So I really got 8. How do you succinctly put across an idea from all this information that you've gathered? It's actually very helpful. So yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Without too much writing on each slide as well. Because yours are very digestible. They don't have much writing on them. So I imagine that takes
that's something I work really hard at. So I've actually got most of my ideas never make it to Instagram because I just can't figure out a way to put them across. Yeah, in that format.
So one of the research reviews you mentioned was the mass research review. And it's been a really nice segue because a lot of the topics we discussed with Brandon have flowed into this discussion. And now a lot of what we've chatted about now, no doubt when Aiden and I go away and plan for that next episode, a lot will be included in that with Eric Helms. For any of the listeners, I'm actually quite interested in getting a subscription. Potentially we could, go halves on that and just you pay the $1,000. There's like a one-up fee where you can buy it for the lifetime.
Oh, yeah, the lifetime one. Yeah.
$1,000 one up, or you can pay, I think it's like $25 to $29 per month for access to that. But I'll put the link in the show notes. Obviously, you're a big proponent for getting access to that research review. Yeah. What other courses, textbooks, reviews, other than the mass research review, would you recommend for anyone out there that's wanting to get some more access to content within the space or, well-informed information?
Yeah, I mean, I think the mass research review is like my probably favorite thing. depends where you're at. Like I do recommend textbooks quite a lot, actually. It's interesting that you mentioned textbooks. I'm a fan of that. Like if you do want to go down the route of maybe really becoming like not, it's not necessary for every coach or whatever, but I do think textbooks are super helpful. So like I have a few of my favorites that I kind of go through. I'm actually bringing up all my textbooks here, but I got I read textbooks quite a lot. I think there's quite a few that are very good in terms of like I think a basic human physiology one is good. A basic health psychology one is good. You could do an exercise phys one once you've done the basic human phys one would be a good idea if you want to go through textbooks. That's always been very helpful for me because I think then in a research setting or when you're looking at other stuff, you just got more foundational knowledge to draw on. You feel a little bit better oriented. That really helps. If you wanted to go so far, you could even do basic statistics, which is not for everybody, but it's there. So I do rate that stuff. But then personally for me, it's literally I look at papers and I look at the research review, and then it's a lot of reflection on what I'm doing with my clients. That's real big because I think you've alluded to it just there that you can build up so much knowledge, but without putting it into practice, it's kind of pointless. So that's probably an issue that I had earlier on was I had way too much knowledge and just not enough actual practice putting it into practice with clients and thinking about how I can modify it to meet them where they're at. That's pretty big. As you can probably tell, I'm much more about like dealing with the quirks of an individual and their psychology these days than I am about understanding exactly the mechanisms of how a supplement works or something like that,
Yeah, cool. I think to wrap up today, one of the things that I personally like about your work, and also it also ties into coming across authentic and having integrity online, is the, I guess, series of posts that you've done over the last couple of years going into things that you've changed your mind on. So an idea that you used to maybe push, an idea that used to dictate some parts of your coaching that you now saw could be done better or wasn't correct. Can you think of any of those off the top of your head that you want to share today?
I mean, if I were to say the overarching theme is the stuff like the top down versus bottoms up coaching. I don't think things need to be perfectly scripted or anything. I think you can kind of get good enough and then just iterate from there with a client. I think you can work with stuff that might be a client preference that's sort of way below suboptimal and still get good results with them. I think you can train way less than you need to. I don't think it matters that you need to maximize carbs to maximize exercise performance in the gym. I think you can go relatively moderate to low carbs and still do very well. I don't think you need to have a big surplus to put on lots of muscle. I think you can have a very small surplus and do that. I mean, it's endless, mate. There's so many things, and a lot of it is minor modifications over time. And then you think back like 5 years, and you go, "Oh, it's actually evolved a lot over that time." It's very rare that I get a sudden like, "Oh, I'm going to do a complete spin on this now." But there's tons of stuff like that, man. So yeah, I think almost every area of fitness I've sort of modified my mindset on a little bit.
And if you had to choose 10 exercises for the rest of your life to build your training around, what 10 exercises would you pick and why?
How many variations of biceps curls can I? No, I'm joking. I actually like training legs the most. Some of my favorites, let's say I really like pendulum squats. I like Romanians. I like a lot of cable variations because I think you can modify the resistance profile easily. And so a lot of exercises feel like more or less comfortable depending on the person. So I love sort of like a behind the back lateral raise, but you can change how far away you stand from the cable, that kind of stuff. So probably a lot of it is more machine based than maybe what a lot of people would think. I like a lot of sort of split squat variations in a Smith machine, for example. Reverse lunges off there for glutes is great. That kind of stuff is all awesome. So I'm not super married to particular exercises, I guess. I keep them pretty simple, but I do like a lot of cable variations because you can just modify them so easily, I think.
Yeah,
But
diversity.
certainly in my gym here, so I got two gyms that I go to. I got one that I've actually got a membership here in Sweden, but they don't have a hack squat and they don't have like a pendulum squat, and it just annoys me because I really love those two variations. And then I just got a little gym in the bottom of our apartment building. That's like a shared thing for the apartment building, and that is literally a cable stack and some dumbbells and some barbells and like a combined hammy curl leg extension. And I find myself going to the basic one in the bottom of my apartment way more often because I find I just don't really need to do that much. You know, it's like you can do some heels elevated squats, you can do all the stuff on the cables, and then like easy. It's very simple, very straightforward.
Reducing that barrier to entry, sort of like James Clear's
Yeah,
stuff.
seriously. Seriously. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thanks for today, Luke. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you. I've loved your insights, and we'll no doubt definitely be in touch again soon. So thanks for your time, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Luke.
Yeah, appreciate it, guys. Thanks a ton.
Legend.
Thanks for having me on.